Hi everyone, my name is Meredith. I'm an unpublished novelist, and I also love learning about writing craft. And today I want to talk about something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and it's called a values conflict. So I want to explain what a values conflict is, the different ways it can be used, where it should be emphasized in story structure, and just what you can do with it. So first of all, a values conflict is exactly what it sounds like, where we have two values and they're conflicting in some way. In my mind, there are two different kinds of values conflicts, and those are within a person, there are two conflicting values, and then also from one person to another, there are conflicting values. And usually this is from a hero to an antagonist or a villain. So a values conflict upgrades the level of storytelling because it adds complexity and depth to your story. It creates well-rounded people who are, like every human being, conflicted. They don't have one way of thinking or doing something. They have two things that are vying for their attention and for their decision making, and they have to make choices that choose either one or the other because they're completely at odds, and they cannot make a choice that honors both of their values. And so this creates complex characters, it creates depth, and it allows us as human beings to think deeply about ideas and gets us honed into actually what makes us tick, why we make our decisions, and what's actually important to us in life and in the stories that we read. One of the easiest and most common types of values conflicts come from internal conflict. So this is what the character should walk onto the stage of the story in the first scene having. And it's essentially this idea of a conflict between the character's fears and the character's goals. And in order to get what they want, they have to confront their fear. And so they have this value of a fear of staying away from something that they have to pit against this desire to go towards something. So this basically helps us see what lengths the hero will go to get what they want, is what they'll sacrifice for. And it's a way of forcing the character to make decisions at every decision point of, am I going to run from what I'm afraid of, or am I going to head towards the goal that I want to achieve? It gives us a test of the hero's character. Every time the hero has to contend with these competing values, it lets us see what they're made of. This is when one value, the fear that they have, is something that we want them to get over and something that is not as important as the goal that they're headed toward. An example of this is Casbrecker from Six of Crows, where he has fears, and so the value is staying away from those fears, and he values not putting himself in a situation where he will confront those fears. And then the other value is he really wants to get his money, he wants to get his revenge, and so those two things come into conflict, and he has to decide, is getting revenge and money worth facing this fear? And so he's pitted up against these decisions. And so that's what we call internal conflict. And this makes characters well rounded, deep. It makes us sympathize with them. It makes us think that whatever journey they're going on is worth it because they're actually giving up a lot or facing a lot in order to get what they want. And so this is a really effective way of doing characterization. But then there's the idea of them having two good values that are at odds. And so they have to choose, or maybe not two good values, but two values that they care about equally, say honor and revenge. In the movie The Patriot, we see these two values pitted against each other, where the character, who's played by Mel Gibson, wants both to be an honorable man and also to get his revenge, and they come into conflict and he has to choose one over the other. And so throughout the story we see him having to make choices of either getting his revenge or being honorable, and it's really interesting watching him contend with these conflicting values because they're both very, very important to him. And then one thing to note here, this is a type of stakes, and this comes from the story equation. So one value or the other is at stake. And this means that something private and personal to the hero is on the line. Whatever the conflict is that they're trying to get over, the goal that they're headed for, is testing which one of these is more important to the hero. So as long as both values are incredibly important to the character and they've built their worldview and who they are on both of these values, it acts as a type of stakes. Okay, so those conflicts of values all are internal. They're within the person themselves. They have two conflicting values. But then we can take it outside of the realm of one human being holding two conflicting values, and we can have one human being with a value conflicting against somebody with a different value. So this is when you have the typical hero who believes very strongly in one value, and the opposite of that value is mirrored by the antagonist or the villain, and the villain fully believes in his or her own value that is in opposition to the hero. What makes the story really satisfying when you have this conflicting value framework is the ending. And so obviously this value will be woven through the entire story, but what makes this really interesting and satisfying at the end is that it's so baked into who the hero is that they can't help but stand on this and act from this value. What you have is the hero's values triumphing over the villain's values. When the hero and the villain come into conflict and their values come into conflict, what's satisfying is if the hero's values are more powerful, stronger, or more potent than the villains. And so basically, their value trumps the villain's values. This can add kind of an epic feel to a story, right? Where it feels like someone is really striving for an ideal and fighting for an ideal. And in the end, that gets to win out. Good versus evil is like the most basic example of a values conflict between a hero and a villain. And there are so many others. And this can be things like selflessness over selfishness. This can be something like honesty over, the power of manipulation. There's a lot of things that are even less black and white than that you can play with to have a hero stand for one thing and a villain stand for the other thing. And there's a lot of ways that you can kind of mess this up. Maybe even have the hero standing for a value that is less strong than the villain, and to have the hero have a negative character arc because of this value. Or sometimes that bad things do happen and bad people do get what they want. And so you can have this complexity in these conflicting values. I think the important thing to remember about this is that this turns into theme. And so, whatever value you go with, if you do have this clash of values between the hero and the villain, is that that's what you're teaching your audience. And so, be careful with what you actually want to have the audience take away from your story, because that's going to be baked into these values, which usually are values that you as a person have, you as the writer. Be intentional with the values that you're instilling in your hero and your villain, but just to say that it can be really satisfying to see a hero's values triumph over a villain, even if the villain is stronger. But that's the reason why the hero wins, is because they have a better view of the world that works and that is more powerful than what the villain believes. Moving on to how the story grid thinks of values. So the story grid has this idea of genres, which basically define kind of the goal of the story. So say for the action genre, there are very specific values that are coming into conflict, and that's life versus death. The hero in an action story is battling death and is striving for life. They're striving to survive. And this is the overarching value conflict that is going on in this genre, and the ones that are going on in the hero internally and also in forces against the hero externally, those can have a lot more nuance. They don't have to be focused exactly on life versus death, but that is the main value in an action story: is do you survive fighting death at every turn? So let's look at a couple other value conflicts that just come with different genres according to the story grid. In the horror genre, the values conflict is life versus fate worse than death. So not just death, but basically the idea of horror, of like suffering, of like terror beyond death. In the crime genre, the values conflict is the difference between justice and injustice and which will win. In the war genre, you come up against things like victory versus defeat. And in the love or romance genre, the core value is exactly what it sounds like, which is the value of love over hate or love over apathy. So I think this is helpful to look at what defines these genres. And like I said, you can go in a totally different direction with what the character themselves are actually struggling with, but I think that they do have to be in line with the core values of the genre itself, right? Because if you're writing a romance story, your hero is going to be fighting for love over, hate or whatever, over any other value that love can come up against, like selfishness or self-protection or apathy. So thinking about what genre you're writing and what core values define that genre can help you define what internal conflict and values conflict that your character should have, and also what the theme of your book should be. And there's a lot of variety and wiggle room in there, but I think knowing the overarching categories and how those values kind of fit those categories can be really helpful. Last thing to talk about is, when in a story will these values conflicts come into play? First of all, the beginning. At the beginning of the story, you want to show the complexity and you want to set the groundwork for what the hero will be struggling with throughout the entire book. And so you want to show their conflicting value, even if it's fear versus goal, or if it's two conflicting values, or if it's hero versus villain value. And then where this comes majorly into play is with the inciting incident. And so in the hero's journey, this is also called call to action, where the hero is being called upon to do something, or they feel that they need to do something, but something is holding them back. And so usually in the hero's journey, there is a refusal of the call, and the hero doesn't take on the journey because they don't want to, because they're afraid of something or they have a hang up or whatever. And that's the conflicting value. So we see right from the start that they have an issue where they are deciding between two conflicting things, two equally strong things in their life. And we know that that's going to set them up for really tough decision making throughout the entire book. And so in the inciting incident, when they actually do choose to heed the call and go on the adventure or the journey or step into the world of Act Two, whatever you like to say, they have to pick one of those values and go with it, because they can't be afraid of the journey and just say, you know what, I'm too afraid, I can't go. Because then you have no story. They have to actually face off against those two values. The next point where in the story you really need to see this values conflict come out, because you don't have to talk about it constantly. Some moments when you really do want this to shine are at the midpoint. And at the midpoint, a lot of times you're going to have what's called a mirror moment, when the hero is going to catch a glimpse of themselves and really have to evaluate what they believe and what they think. And this isn't a turning point. They're not going to make a full change here, but they are going to actually confront themselves. And in this moment, if you have an internal values conflict, then you really need the hero to take a good look at what they believe. And so the midpoint is a really good place to do that, because the midpoint is when the stakes are going to be raised. And usually there's a lot of danger, there's a twist, there's an information reveal. It makes the hero take a look at what they're really doing, who they are, what they're going toward. And this is a great place to bring up a values conflict. And then, of course, the next great place to bring it up is in the finale, because you have to resolve a values conflict at the end of the book, unless you have a series where you're dragging it out. But I really think that if you're going to create a cohesive book, I think that a values conflict should be at least partway resolved by the end. Like I was saying with the hero's journey, the hero and the villain are having their final face off, and one value is going to trump the other, and you need to show which one wins out. In a story like The Patriot, where you have two equally held values like honor versus revenge, you can harmonize them, and you can have the hero figure out a way to have both and live by both. But to do this, you probably have to have the hero get over something else, some flaw that they're holding on to that is preventing them from actually living out their value code and their value system. And then if you have internal conflict the typical way, which is, you have a fear versus a goal, then you need to have them get over the fear, or at least face the fear to a sufficient amount where the reader will feel like the value that they're going toward has trumped the fear that they believe. So yeah, at the ending, make sure that you clear up your values conflict, or at least show some type of resolution, even if it means that you're harmonizing two values. But a lot of times you want to see one kind of winning out over the other, and the hero making the right decision, the hero finally realizing which value is more important. And then with that value, whichever one that they figure out is more important, then have them defeat the bad guy or achieve their goal in the end using the knowledge of that value. So those are my thoughts on values conflicts. They are really, really interesting. They create a lot of conversation, and some of the best, most thought-evoking stories that humans have come up with have been based on two conflicting values and which one is stronger, which one wins out. And so this is a really, really powerful storytelling element. And I think that most stories could benefit from having some type of conflicting values that challenge what the reader, the writer, and the characters believe. So next time you're creating characters or coming up with plot, think about adding conflicting values. That's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like and also subscribe to see more from me. Happy writing, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.